Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 29th episode of the Disruptive Friday series. I'm 𝗬𝗃𝗏𝗃, the project manager and community curator at the Disruption Network Lab. And today's episode is titled Beef Banks and Brazilian Amazon, using geospatial data to investigate deforestation. And before we start today, we would like to state that it has been deeply sad and speechless to witness the Russian invasion on Ukraine yesterday. And here in Berlin, we have been working for years as a platform to expose and call out systems of oppression and injustice. And from that position, we condemn the Russian military invasion in Ukraine today, and military invasion terrorizing civilians everywhere and every day. And we stand in solidarity against war, oppression, and we oppose any form of military imperialism. As for that, and for today's topic of the Disruptive Friday, I'm glad to welcome with me Sam Leon, the head of data investigation at Global Witness, and Louis Godard, senior data investigations advisor at Global Witness. And with both of them, we will discuss the role of Brazilian beef companies in driving the climate crisis, and the role of the big name banks and investors in driving tropical deforestation. I would also like to thank the Disruption Network Lab team and the Boiling Head Media for their continuous work with us on all the online content production that we have been doing. And I would also, for everyone's watching us, I would like to remind you that on our website, we have a chat where you can interact with our speakers during the live stream and also ask us questions that we will then deliver it to our speakers that they can respond to at the end of this live stream. And for this particular Disruptive Friday and for the previous two, they have been all part of the project Challenging Corruption, Empowering Future Voices, a project that started in October last year and until April this year. And the project is funded by the GEZ, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit. The project is a series of online workshops that is attended by a closed circle of participants, in addition to an online engagement through the Disruptive Fridays. And the program is focused on people between the age of 18 and 30 years from the continents of Europe, Africa, and the Middle Eastern region. The project serves to open a conversation and training awareness about corruption and trying to identify what is corruption and question different ways, tools to imagine to how we can challenge that. Corruption is a very wide and contextualized term with lots of definitions in different places. So for this series, we have focused on 4 topics to tackle corruption through economic inequality, public health care, climate crisis, and the freedom of expression. For today, we are hosting the 4th event of this series, the 3rd Disruptive Friday, and there is still one more Disruptive Friday coming out in March, and our closing workshop will be on the 13th of April. So I will now hand over to our guests, Sam and Louis. And thank you, Sam, for taking the role of moderating this conversation. So I hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nada. And great to be here. Thanks very much to Disruption Network Lab for inviting us. It's great to be part of this sort of Disruptive Friday. So just as a way of introduction, I am Head of Data Investigations at Global Witness. Global Witness is a campaigning organisation that does original investigative research to expose abuses of power. We're about 100 people. We have offices in London, DC, in Belgium, and in Beijing. And for the first couple of decades of our existence as an NGO, we focus primarily on natural resource governance and corruption, so specifically exposing bribery around big mining deals that ultimately diverted public funds and deprived people in producer countries of a decent standard of living. A lot of our work during this period focused on places like Angola, DRC, and Cambodia. We've recently started to work in a much more focused fashion on the climate crisis, and specifically exposing the polluting companies that drive it. So looking a lot at the oil and gas majors like Chevron and Gazprom, but also the big agribusinesses like the world's largest beef companies, which we'll be looking at later in this talk, and their role, particularly in tropical deforestation. And part of this frame and our take and our angle on this is I guess, looking at what you might refer to as sort of legalized corruption, how our politics has been captured by groups who subvert the public interest and prevent us from systematically reducing greenhouse gas emissions, stopping deforestation, and weaning our economies off coal, oil, and gas. And we look at how these companies that we investigate try to shield themselves from being held accountable for their actions by greenwashing their image, and subverting the regulations and the audit processes that are meant to keep them in check. So our job, as I see it, is then to undermine the influence of these groups, to grow public understanding of how their power is wielded, the effects of their actions, particularly the environmental destruction that they perpetuate, and ultimately change laws in order to change our politics. And how do we do that? So as I said, Global Witness focuses on doing investigative research, and we combine policy work with traditional investigative journalism and with data science. And so mine and Louis' team, as we said, is the data investigations team. So the piece that we focus on is very much about how to use digital tools to piece together the true picture of a company's activities. And of course, this isn't always easy. Polluters these days are spending a lot of money in order to avoid scrutiny and distract from how damaging their activities really are. They might, and they do employ PR firms that engage in sponsorship of sports events, or perhaps big cultural institutions and museums, through which they're able to launder their image and muddy the water. And then, of course, there's their lobbying activities. Oil and gas companies, for instance, spent about $115 million last year in the US on lobbying politicians and officials. And our own research around COP26 showed that there are about over 500 fossil fuel lobbyists present at the COP, and giving you a bit of a picture of how significant the influence of these companies remains at the world's most significant agenda-setting event for climate policy. So our job then at Global Witness is to get past the greenwash and try and get to the truth. And as well as the fossil fuel companies, who are well known for their role in the climate crisis, there's another group of companies that we look at a lot that are culpable when it comes to the situation we find ourselves in. And these are major agribusinesses. So major agribusinesses use industrial and large-scale farming mechanisms to produce the ingredients that make it into our supermarkets. But their practices are often highly damaging to the environment and are a major driver of greenhouse gas emissions. According to the IPCC, 23% of greenhouse gas emissions are caused by land use change, and this includes 11% of greenhouse gas emissions which come from deforestation. The production of a small group of so-called forest risk commodities, so this is soy, beef, palm, pulp and paper, cocoa and rubber, are the primary drivers of this deforestation. So vast tracts of tropical forests are cleared all the time to rear these crops. Between 2001 and 2015, it's estimated that an area of forest twice the size of Germany was replaced by these crops. And so this is devastating for our carbon sinks, of course, which reduce nature's ability to soak up anthropogenic emissions, meaning we get higher concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere, and of course more global warming as a result. So what Louis will be speaking to you about is really picking apart our unique approach to getting to the real story about a group of very destructive companies, and how we employed data science and engineering techniques and satellite imagery to build a picture of their opaque supply chains, which, as we'll see, are one of the sort of primary drivers of deforestation in the Amazon. And the companies in question are, of course, international brands operating across the globe. The extent of their complicity in rainforest destruction was obscured by a dysfunctional system of audits, and which they hid behind in many ways to greenwash their image and say their supply chains were deforestation free. The story is an important one of how we can use digital tools to counter the greenwash of companies responsible for the climate crisis and begin to effect real change. So over to you, Louis, and I'll be taking questions from the chat after your initial presentation.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Sam, and it's brilliant to be here, as you said, and thank you to Nada for introducing us before. So I'm just briefly going to summarize some of the key findings of this report that I'm going to be kind of running over today, and then I'm going to take you through the specific data sources that we used. It's really a question of combining 3 distinct data sources that we acquired in 3 different ways to come up with the analysis that we were able to do for this particular report that I'm talking about today. So just to discuss some of the key findings. So we looked at the largest Amazon state in Brazil. It's called Pará. It's to the north of Brazil on the sort of bump on the top right, if you're familiar with the country on a map. It's a huge state, a massive area, but it's a hugely important area for cattle ranching. So there's loads of cattle farms all over the place in this state, hidden in kind of deep in the jungle. Bits of jungle are being, of rainforest, I should say, are being cleared, and all just to sort of serve as pasture for these cattle. We looked at the big 3 beef trading companies: JBS, Marfrig, and Minerva, all Brazilian companies which source from farms in this region and sell both within Brazil and overseas. The big problem is that these companies have really, really complicated supply chains. So they source from ranches in this area and all over Brazil. In turn, the ranches that rear cattle source the cattle from other ranches. So the cattle will be reared for a short time on one ranch, and then they'll be sold to another. And so it creates this sort of quite complicated supply chain where you have direct suppliers to the big companies, and then you have sort of indirect suppliers to those direct suppliers. So what we sought to do was to kind of get a picture of all of this stuff using data-driven methods. Our ultimate finding was that the 3 companies I mentioned, JBS, Marfrig, and Minerva, had bought cattle from 379 ranches containing more than 20,000 football fields of illegal deforestation over a 3-year period that we looked at. So this is direct suppliers. We also looked at indirect suppliers, so the ranches that supply JBS, Marfrig, and Minerva. We found that an additional 4,000 ranches further down their supply chains, with an estimated total of something like 140,000 football fields of deforestation. I'm talking about soccer here. We found that they also were at risk of not being in compliance with no deforestation commitments that these companies have signed up to. This is in some ways an unprecedented bird's eye view of the supply chains, because the companies are very resistant to doing this type of analysis of their own supply chains. They have audits that are carried out by big kind of environmental auditing companies, often international ones, like a company called DNV-GL, Grant Thornton, a British company. They sort of audit the supply chains of the companies, but to date, the audits that have happened have shown relatively few issues, and we wanted to sort of question that a little bit and show that perhaps these audits aren't being carried out as fully as they could be. The real issue that we're getting at here, though, is not so much the companies themselves and the sourcing from the deforestation, but it's in fact the funding of these companies, of JBS, Marfrig and Minerva, the three big beef trading companies, by Western and European and American banks and other financial institutions. So that's where the heart of the problem is, in our view, in Global Witness's view, and what we're trying to tackle is large banks, Deutsche Bank, Santander, Barclays, these companies underwriting bonds and loans that are given to the big agribusinesses to expand their operations in an area that we know is hugely risky for the climate and for the forest. Before I start going into the data, I just wanted to say that all of these three companies I've mentioned all contested the results of our analysis that I'm talking about here. They contested the majority of the sales we identified as being associated with illegal deforestation. In some cases, they said they didn't recognize purchases that we'd mentioned in the report. We reviewed all of their responses to our findings and the data that they supplied, and we completely stand by our analysis, which is documented extensively elsewhere as well. So now, having summarized the kind of key points, I wanted to take you through the data sources. So we relied on three. Number one, deforestation areas. That's the sort of obvious one. So we need to know where the deforestation is happening. Number two, property boundaries. So this is where the farms are, where the cattle ranches are. And then cattle sales. So this is the data that allows you to build up a picture of the supply chain and to determine which farms are selling to which beef companies. I'll take you through each one a little bit more detail. If my slide clicker is working, I'm just connecting. So here's a map of deforestation areas. So this data is published by the Brazilian federal government. It's based on satellite imagery, and then through a combination of computer algorithms and human verification, they publish these little, on the picture there, I've put these in red, areas of deforestation detected in satellite imagery over the years. There are regular updates, and it's all publicly available, so anyone can use this data to do the sort of analysis we've done. It's quite big and somewhat difficult to work with, which perhaps reduces the overall usefulness. But there are sort of other projects and organizations that we work with who open this up and make it all sort of available through a web-based interface. So it's a really good data source, and it's very impressive that the Brazilian government, publishes all this in such a timely way, I think. The second data source I mentioned was property boundaries. So these are published on a state-by-state basis by the different states in the Amazon and across the whole of Brazil. So we were looking at Pará, as I mentioned, and here's a little image of some of the properties. You can see how complex this data is. There are, thousands of properties, tens of thousands in any given state, and they all closely sort of border each other. So we had to sort of take this data and overlay that with the deforestation data to determine which farms had been carrying out deforestation. We also obviously had to look at the time period of the deforestation to check that it falls within the period covered by the big beef companies' no deforestation commitments. So they've made public commitments not to source from farms that are involved in deforestation over a certain period. This data is all publicly available again. It's a bit less easy to sort of download and work with than the deforestation data because it's behind a sort of search interface where you have to type in a complicated code for each farm. But we worked out we wrote a little tool to sort of scrape this data off the internet and compile it into a database which we could then use. So the final piece of the puzzle, it's a little bit small on here probably for people to see, but this is what's known as an animal transit guide. So when you move cows or really any animals in Brazil, you need to issue a document called an animal transit guide. And it gives some basic information about the animals. So here it gives the age and the sex of the cows that are being sold from one farm to another. And it gives you details of the seller and the buyer. So you can imagine if you get enough of these together and compile them into some sort of database, you end up with essentially a picture of the supply chain of all of these different farms and slaughterhouses and companies. So in this example here, I mean, probably it doesn't, the one on the screen, but it might say a cow, 12 cows are being sold from farm X to JBS. And there we would have an instance of direct supply. But it may also show cows going from a farm further down the supply chain in the complex kind of myriad of indirect suppliers that I mentioned before, going to farm X. And then we have another document that goes from farm X to JBS. And so we would build up a sort of indirect link there. The tricky thing about these documents is they're all only accessible if you search on a particular state government website and type in the exact code for the document. So they're not really available as a sort of mass resource for analysis, which is problematic for NGOs working on these type of issues and other sort of civil society organizations in Brazil who want to be able to monitor this. So what we did was write another web scraping program, which kind of crawled through all of the potential numbers that these documents could have, and downloaded them. And we ended up with something like 3 million records for the sort of 3 years that we were looking at. And so this has proved an amazingly useful resource for us for future work as well, because you can kind of just dip in and get a kind of real look at the supply chain, or zoom in on a particular area of it whenever you like, using this data set. And combining it, obviously, you get a picture of the whole picture. So this is just my final kind of thing to kind of get across while I talk about the data aspect, is just how it all fits together. So you've got the data coming in from sort of published data, like the deforestation boundaries, as I mentioned, it's all open. You've got some web scraping going on, which is the sort of process of crawling through many web pages and downloading data, putting it into a database. And then you've got analysis using some software called QGIS, which is geospatial data software. So we sort of trained up our investigators on our forest team, on our Amazon team, to use this software, so that they were really, really adept at sort of zooming into individual shapes, verifying, oh, is this really deforestation, or is this sort of something that's been picked up by the satellite accidentally? Does it overlap to the correct amount with the farm we're looking at? All these sort of really in-depth questions that you need an expert eye on. We work really closely with our investigators, Chris and Marco, who are super expert in the subject area as well. So I think that was the real key here, a marriage of data and subject expertise. Little bit of a view of what the finished products, the finished analytical product for them would look like. So in blue there you have a farm. In red you've got the areas of deforestation. And then obviously underneath it all you've got a layer of satellite imagery that we've put there to allow them to compare. And we have tools and things to allow you to change the date of the satellite imagery, for instance, and check, did this bit of deforestation happen in 2013 or 2014? Check the details and that kind of thing. And so it's proved a really useful workflow for a lot of our work now, this sort of geospatial stuff. And obviously it facilitates data analysis as well, and charts. This slide is more just to show the charts rather than anything in particular, but you can see that on the left there's a map of Pará, the state. So we were able to see that a very large number of cattle sales as a proportion of the total came from this municipality I've put in red there, called São Félix de Xingu. Quite a remote sort of Wild West kind of place, but it really gives you a sense of the concentration of cattle sales in that area. And then on the right, we've done some analysis of the size of farms that the big beef companies buy from. You probably won't be able to see the details there, but what this shows is that the companies tend to source either from very large farms or from very small farms, which is an interesting finding. So you get this sort of divergence of many small farms at some points in the supply chain, and then some sort of mega farms at other points in the supply chain, where cows get sort of bunched into there and then sold on. So just a demonstration of what collecting all this data can allow you to do, and some of the sort of avenues that we're going to go down in the future. And I believe we'll be kind of coming on to some of those a little bit later in this session. I'll leave it there before I bore anyone with data too much, but looking forward to hearing any questions.
Thanks very much, Louis. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I would encourage people to continue putting them there. Before we go on, though, it might be worth just for the audience just to touch on some of the impacts the report has had, if you're able to speak to them at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, the real aim of the report is to target the financial institutions, or the real aim of our whole campaigning in this area is to target the financial institutions and bankroll and fund these agribusinesses. So perhaps the best outcome of the report so far was one thing we were very pleased to learn of, which is that the Norwegian Pension Fund's Council of Ethics has put one of the companies, 𝗵𝗹𝗶𝗶, under observation. So this means that they're going to have to seriously consider whether they will get involved with this company in the future in terms of loans and bonds. And so it's a small step, but it's one large financial institution that's seriously thinking about the reputational risks of getting involved in companies like those that we've profiled in this report. This is that's an interesting one. It's perhaps an easier target than some of the big banks, because it's linked to the Norwegian government. This is a big funder of this kind of climate work, so there's an easiness there. But we hope that that it's the start of many more of those type of decisions. That's only one part of the impact, though. So we also have more direct impacts. So these companies do have a system of blocking suppliers from their supply chains when they've been proven to be involved in illegal deforestation. So in at least one case, I think, as a result of this report, and maybe several, the companies have actually directly blocked farms from supplying cattle to them after the findings of our report. So that's nice. I think we have this sort of two-stage impact thing where you've got the immediate impacts on the farms. You've also got the impacts on the financing of the companies themselves. I mean, I guess a bit more sort of woolly, but a bit less concrete is just the impact on the broader data ecosystem and journalism and sort of research in this area. So I like to think that the more work we do in this, the more it catalyzes other organizations to take a look at the findings, replicate the methodology. We certainly relied on looking at other organizations' work to inspire us to do this. So yeah, we'd like to work out in the open, publish our code and data and stuff as we can. And I think that has a little bit of an effect on, a sort of snowball effect, hopefully, encouraging other organizations to do more of this.
Thanks, Louis. Great. So we can go over to the questions that we do have then. So one, someone is asking here, namely import companies of meat in Germany. So this isn't something that we looked at specifically for this report. We do know that a company like JBS does supply a number of supermarkets in Europe. We haven't looked specifically into the German case, though I'm sure that information is out there, and our colleagues who we worked with on this report may know more, so we can certainly circle back on that. I'm sure there's lots of other interesting journalism on the topic if you're particularly interested in the German case, and it would be wonderful. One of our hopes is through sharing kind of more of this information, it encourages others to take up different parts of the supply chain and investigations into different parts of the supply chain in order to put pressure, whether or not it's on supermarkets or the companies themselves. We have another question here, which is regarding import taxes. Would increased import taxes in making Amazonian meat less attractive for foreign consumers? I'm sure that could have a role, but as Louis alluded to, the real focus for us is on the financing of the operations. You could imagine a situation in which a country introduces an import tax. on a set of products that contain certain Brazilian beef from companies that are engaging in or complicit in deforestation. And that wouldn't necessarily have the effect you'd want, because they could sell more meat to another country. So I think it's slightly more direct by going for the financing, the key lifeline through which these companies finance their operations. They're going to really struggle if they're not able to secure, as Louis was saying, more capital via the issuance of bonds or getting loans or investments. With regards, but yeah, I think we should, like everything on climate, we should have a sort of multi-pronged attack, and I think import taxes can be useful. I think another thing worth highlighting in this context is, for instance, in the UK, and I know that there's similar laws currently under consideration in the EU, but in the UK, where there's something called the UK Environment Act. This is looking at making it illegal for large companies to import forest risk commodities. So actually, we're kind of looking to go more direct, rather than introducing a kind of another price mechanism, to actually ban the import of commodities associated with illegal deforestation. And we're working hard to make sure that finance is considered part of that. So banks headquartered in the UK or in Europe can't also get off the hook and continue to finance these companies to the tune of millions of dollars. The last question we had, and maybe I'll pass this one back to Louis, because I know you've worked with some colleagues here, is what about the role of Brazilian civil society or NGOs in this project or in campaigning more broadly on these issues?
Yeah, definitely happy to talk to that. And I think maybe I'll combine it with another question we've had about whether this, whether we thought to specifically do this investigation in the Brazilian context, or whether you can kind of extrapolate it to others and do it elsewhere in the world. So I think it's what's really important to emphasize here, particularly as a UK-based NGO, is that there's a really, really good work going on the ground in Brazil on all of this stuff, and we rely heavily on data produced by not only government organizations in Brazil, but also civil society organizations that kind of compile this stuff and really, really investigate stuff on the ground. So yeah, there's a really vibrant ecosystem of work on deforestation in Brazil, as you'd expect. But I think what's most important is there's a very well-established and strong tech sector, and very, very high technical skills among those NGOs and in government as well. So you've got a really, really sort of buzzing data ecosystem that gives you stuff like the deforestation data. It gives you things like there are NGOs providing sort of timely alerts on when a farm has been involved in deforestation. And being able to bring those together through things like public APIs. These are sort of ways that developers can kind of automatically consume data from a number of different services and combine them together and mash them up and sort of do the work that we're doing. I think there's something about the Brazilian context that makes this particularly possible. I know we've had as part of our work at Global Witness, we've been scoping out other areas of tropical deforestation, and indeed have been working on others for many years in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and other places, and I've often found it difficult to get hold of the data we need to do this type of analysis. And so in the Brazilian case, I think it's one of those situations where it's an ideal, just happens to be ideal in the sense of data availability. But in terms of just to go back to NGOs, I mean, there are a whole range of them, and it's obviously a contentious, as the question kind of hints at, it's a contentious political situation with the Bolsonaro government there as well. So we're always keen to sort of bear that in mind as we consider how we work with those organizations. Thanks,
Louis. Some great questions coming in. do you have safety concerns or recommendations for activists? So specifically in the context of partners that we work with in Brazil? Yes, absolutely. This is something we always have for our work. I'm not personally in a position to make sort of recommendations here for activists kind of on the front line of this work who sort of more directly, face physical risks with respect to their research. But yeah, this is absolutely something that's incorporated in anywhere where we work, where people might face risk or danger. And we're acutely aware that it's one thing for us to be doing kind of data analytical work some distance from where the brunt of this problem is being felt, and the immediate effects of this being felt. We have a sort of a campaign that intersects to some degree with this work on deforestation and big agribusinesses looking at killings of environmental defenders and people who are basically standing up to corporate abuses. And we're acutely aware. We think that's a hugely important issue to highlight. And as I said, wherever we do, and we do extensively work with groups in Brazil, we have to absolutely bear that in mind. But I probably wouldn't be the person to make recommendations for activists on this front, although we certainly work with people within our organisation and outside that could, if we wanted to do a separate session on that. What are your concrete recommendations for finance institutions and investors? That's a really great question. So I think kind of like the sort of the broad point on the recommendations would be that it needs to be a requirement that better environmental due diligence, including risk of deforestation, needs to take place. So this isn't currently taking place. There is no expectation currently, or mandatory expectation in most countries, to do that kind of due diligence. We would say, of course, what we want is for there to be absolutely no financing of deforestation. But the question is we know that the issue is, and we face this across Global Witness, all of Global Witness's work, voluntary commitments to do things won't cut it. Institutions can make no deforestation pledges, or they can sign up to voluntary agreements, and yet they don't act. So the key thing really here, particularly for places like the UK, jurisdictions like the EU or the US, where many of the world's most powerful financial institutions are headquartered, is for us to introduce laws that compel financial institutions to take deforestation risk seriously in those things they finance, and to then remove ultimately to remove financing going to companies that are found to be complicit in deforestation. And I think what's quite exciting about some of this work, and this is about the data investigations team, is that often we see the excuse from the banks and the companies. They say it's too difficult. There's not enough data out there. We don't understand what's going on with indirect supply chains of cattle. And I think by prototyping this stuff, with an organization, a relatively small team, Louis was the lead engineer on this, nowhere near the amount of technical capacity that a bank or an asset manager might have. He was able to come up with a methodology for doing this and to look inside the supply chains and monitor for deforestation. So this is a kind of prototype and a model that we're saying, you can use this. This isn't an excuse anymore. One last question, and one last question that I think we just have to wrap up. Do we have data from Peru, deforestation for new coffee plantations? That's a great question. I'll ask Louis if he's familiar with that, but we don't. We are working in many other countries looking at big agribusiness, at different forest risk crops. I'm not sure if we've looked specifically at coffee in Peru, but Louis, do you have anything more to add on that?
Well, all I would say is I don't have specific data on Peru, but any country where you're able to get property boundaries for the farms, you're pretty much halfway there, because you can use satellite imagery. We sort of cheated here by using pre-cooked deforestation areas published by the Brazilian government, but it's entirely possible for you yourself to use free satellite imagery published by from satellites like Landsat and the ESA's Sentinel satellite to look at deforestation yourself. So once you know the locations of farms, that's the key thing, I think. And then obviously the supply chain side of it, knowing a bit about the sales. But yeah, what I'd initially look for is something similar to the Rural Environmental Register, it's called in Brazil, but the program that shows you the locations of farms. I think that would be the key thing to search for in Peru. And I'm happy to discuss further if you'd like to email us after the session.
Thanks, Louis. That's great. So we're gonna, I think we're gonna wrap up this public session now and pass back to Nada. But yeah, great talking to everyone about this. And as Louis says, I think our kind of emails or Twitter accounts will be circulated, and looking forward to speaking to those of you who will be joining for the private session in more detail. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam and Louis, for this brief and interesting session about the topic. I know there's too much to say, but we're also going to join our program participants later for a group discussion. So yeah, this was the end of today's Disruptive Friday episode, but also would like to invite you to check out our first program of this year, first conference program, the Kill Cloud, Networked Warfare, Drones and AI. The conference will take place in Berlin between the 25th and the 27th of March at Studio 1 Kunstquartier Bethanien, and also it will be live streamed on our online channels, website and YouTube and Facebook. So just very briefly about who did we invite at the program and what we will be discussing or concerned with during that time. So we have invited drone whistleblowers Lisa Lang, Sean Westmoreland and Brandon Bryant, along with others, among them Tanil Youssef, Chantal Meloni, Khalil Diwan and Amran Fayrouz. And on the second day, on Saturday, there won't be on live stream, but in Berlin we will be screening the documentary National Bird, directed by Sonia Kinnebek, who I've also screened a film in our last program last year about Reality Winner. But on this documentary, we'll give a more of an insight on the US drone program from the perspective of 3 whistleblowers. And among them, Lisa will be also, and Brandon will also be with us during the conference. And on the last day, on Sunday, the 27th of March, not only also in Berlin, not on live stream, we'll be hosting a 2 community workshop for our all year round community program. So for more details, the full program is online on our website at disruptionlab.org, and you can buy your online your ticket for the Berlin conference, and it will be live streamed for free on online. For this event, we will continue the discussion that we actually started on the first conference at the Disruption Network Lab on 2015. And it's about warfare whistleblowing, referring to the use of AI technology and satellite for surveillance and for the purposes of enabling target killing, investigation, this crucial topic, and more recent development on the drone war and the strategic use of the AI on the lives of many civilians in the act of target killing using drones and AI technology. So join us either in Berlin or online. And again, thank you, Sam and Louis, very much. And see you soon. And yeah, we have a long year of more programs to come. But for tonight, that would be it. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.